Assalamu alaikum ji. मेरा नाम है Zeeshan Salahuddin. Please welcome to this podcast that specifically looks at the intersection of climate change and geopolitics, and it is part and parcel of what is called Conversations at the Foothills. My guest today, the very salient Kashmala Kakakhel, climate change expert, specifically climate finance expert from Pakistan, but recognized globally for her efforts over the last 18 years in a wide variety of areas, be it the mobilization of funds, as well as ensuring that a certain amount of money flows into Pakistan as far as climate change is concerned. Then her soundness from a technical standpoint, as well as being part of negotiations on behalf of Pakistan at COPs and various other international fora. And we're very glad to have us with her here today. Welcome, Kashmala. Thank you so much for being here.
Assalamu alaikum, Zeeshan. Thank you very much for that introduction.
No softballs to kick off. We've had a couple of very strange days, especially after the attack in Kashmir, India threatening to completely let go of the Indus Water Treaty. That, of course, has severe geopolitical implications. Pakistan has also fired back, closing the airspace, expelling a lot of the diplomats, and vice versa. How do you see the situation unfolding, particularly from a climate lens, especially if we look at the Indus Water Treaty and how Pakistan is very reliant on some of these rivers as an agrarian economy to continue to drive its economy?
An interesting start to the conversation. And as things are unfolding, lots of things are happening as we speak. It's a very fluid situation, not just in between India and Pakistan, but globally as well, on the larger geopolitics. Whenever we've discussed the Indus Water Treaty, regardless of what's been happening in the last couple of days, the one thing that we've always raised is that this is something that was negotiated back in the 1950s, which was, and it was agnostic to the impacts of climate change between an upper riparian and a lower riparian country at that time. And there was a lot of discussion in closed rooms around how would we insert some of the climate impacts in the conversation where the two countries can actually sit together and talk about the issue. Because no matter how many wars we've fought, this is one thing that we've had the channel open on. The commissioners have regularly met and we've updated each other as per the agreement consistently. Barring the suspension that just happened a couple days ago from the Indian side. So we've always been concerned about the fact that it was climate agnostic anyway, and there's a need to look at it from that lens. But then it goes back to, given the geopolitics and given the nature of the relationship between the two countries, and given that water is a lifeline for lower riparian country in general also, the fact that it's a water deal, should you be opening it up to a conversation, or should you be annexing some of the details that show the climate impacts to a deal that has already been agreed? So while we were still trying to figure out what the potential solutions could be, it now stands suspended. It's too soon to pull the trigger on which direction it could go. It's too soon to say, should Pakistan go back and talk to, say, maybe renegotiating it, because given lots of other elements we have to consider before we open it up in any sort of a conversation at this stage. So too soon to give any technical reaction on it at the moment.
But I guess my question to you is, with the kind of climate crisis that Pakistan is facing, what kind of efforts do you think do we need to spend in order to try and see that on both borders, for better or for worse, given the fight that we need to fight internally with climate change, how do we normalize things enough so that the amount of attention that we are paying to a particular crisis is not diluted by virtue of it being eaten up elsewhere?
Right. So you were taking the conversation from a bilateral problem to a multilateral problem now. Climate change, and I think just for a very layman conversation, it's climate. It's greenhouse gas emissions that don't respect boundaries. So it's a global issue. It's not that if Pakistan is emitting, the impact will only be in Pakistan, which means all the countries are responsible for what's happening in Pakistan, so to speak. which means two things. One is you look at the source, which is who's responsible, and that's where international negotiations come in. And second, you look at no matter what negotiations and who's responsible, while all of that is happening in the background, there's impact on ground. So you need to adapt to the impacts of climate change. That requires money, that requires institutional arrangements, that requires consistency of policies. So no matter what's happening outside your border, you need to have a sense of what is it, given that this is a long-term problem, right? This is a problem that we thought, back in the early 2000s, we used to talk about climate change is going to happen in the future, right? But that's the future we're living, right? We're looking at perhaps we're looking at extreme, one of a kind data point coming out, whether it's floods, whether it's disasters, whether it's heat waves, everywhere.
Hailstorm that happened last
week. The hailstorm that happened. So everything that we're looking at over the last 20 years is an extreme event, in Pakistan and generally also. So you are in a situation where you're having, forget conflicts, forget wars, forget everything else, that wo to hai hai, but you're actually dealing with a natural man-made catastrophe for which you need to be prepared, no matter what is happening within the negotiations and who's to blame and all of that. We can get into that in more detail.
And it's not the key thing that I think to realize, and I was having this conversation with a friend recently, is that this is not a rational actor that you can negotiate with.
Correct.
Climate change will do what it wants to do on a relatively predictable cycle, but within those cycles and within those bands, it's highly unpredictable. For example, the hailstorm.
Predictable is one word that doesn't go with climate change. The only thing that's predictable is that it's going to continue to increase the frequency and magnitude. So we can, that's one thing we can plan for, that it will continue to increase. And you're absolutely right. So that's the sort of situation you're dealing with. Like I said, kahan ho raha hai, the impacts, who's responsible, that's a separate conversation. But within your own confines, within your own border, what is it that you can do at your own level? And this is across governments. This is something that I've been noticing and I've been looking at and speaking to, is the fact that, Cholo, let me ask you, what do you think is Pakistan's climate strategy?
I don't think that we have a cogent enough climate strategy at the moment.
Thank you. If there were other people in the room, they may have referred me to the climate change policy. They may have told me that there's a nationally determined contribution that we've submitted to the UNFCCC. Somebody would then refer me to our EV policy.
We have an adaptation plan.
We have an adaptation
climate change
plan.
authority.
So, but then I would ask you, what is the origination for all of these plans? And you know what the answer would be? They are all originated out of requirements for international agreements that we've signed off, which means we have a checkered set of strategies and policies that may at the end may or may not be speaking to each other, right? Because they say you need to submit a NAP, which is a National Adaptation Plan, as part of this negotiation decision that was taken, reference. And we just go down and do that and we submit it, without really thinking what is our strategy, which direction does Pakistan want to get into, given the way you explained it when you opened up the question. And again, this is an issue which you cannot look at from a 5-year prism. 5-year, assuming that's the number of years we have a government in place, right? Because then this is something that has to have a much longer view in terms of what policies, what sectors, what issues you want to tackle first and how you want to lay that out. You have communities on the front lines. You know exactly what the problems are now. We can't deny and we can't act like we don't know. Yes, fine, like the hailstorm was really out of the blue, right? Who could have thought the kind of damage it could cause, right? But the fact that there is predictability in the kind of damage it can cause, no matter what's happening outside, some things we need to prepare for. And then the question is, what sort of preparation, right? So there are various financial instruments available, various partnerships that we can do, various ways where you can blend finance. For somebody to understand, okay, the car that destroyed the hail that destroyed the windshields of my car. Some of them were insured, they were fine. There were others who were not insured, which basically means you have the capacity to cope with a disaster. So you've put in place certain financial systems which allows you to deal with a disaster that you don't even know the magnitude and frequency of. So take this to a government level, right? What sort of contingencies do you need to have in place where you're not running around looking for funding when a disaster happens, and you don't have to do global appeals all the time, where, 2022 is one example that we have in front of. Pakistan needs to balance its global responsibility towards reducing its emissions. We're less than 1%. That's something that we keep talking about, we keep quoting. But then at the same time, there is our own population, our own energy needs, all of that, right, that we need to take care of. And that's not just us. The example of Germany is right in front of us. When the Ukraine war happened, that December, just before the war happened, the war broke out in February. In December, we all signed off at the COP in UK, where we all said we will phase out of fossil fuels, right? And you had Europe's very much in the middle and in the thick of things. And 2 or 3 months later, when that happens, they said, hey guys, it's winter, we need to take care of our people, we will open up our coal power plants.
And someone has blown up Nord Stream.
And someone has done what they had done. So when it comes to geopolitics and when it comes to national interests, it's very easy for some people to move away from renewables and sort of say, hey, this is, quick wins. Which is why I feel it's important for Pakistan. Again, it goes to how much political space you have to negotiate some of these things. Coming back to your question around where is the money to be able to transition. Yes, we've committed to all of these. We've done all of those things, but the money is not there, right? We all know that. Even with what people are committing. For example, by 2030, we look at the requirements by 2030, because, we are targeting, let's all be zero emissions by 2050. So in order to get there, there are milestones that people have set, right? What do we need to do by 2030, 35, 40? You need 8.7 trillion annually to be able to reach the targets of the net zero and reducing it, keeping the temperature rise below 2 degrees. Whereas we're not even doing, say, 1 trillion annually. And this is public, private, I'm talking about all funds at this stage. So there's a huge gap between what's required and what people are actually churning out, even if it's through partnerships. And I'm talking various financial instruments. Forget about just grants, because so it's a difficult sell, right? Number one. The silver lining in all of this is when you talk about to anybody, right? Forget about climate change. If you want me to change my practices, show me the business case. For example, Pakistan, the number of solar panels that we have now in Islamabad and all other countries, in fact, the penetration in the villages is quite high at the moment as well, is not because we care about climate or we want to reduce our 1% even further, but it's just because it made better economic sense, right? The fact that energy was being, back in 2009, it was taking about $400 to create energy from renewables, one megawatt, it came down to about 40, right? So the business case is in there. So the silver lining along all of these things is, while the money is hard to come by because of technology and because of some improvements, some sectors, we are seeing shifts.
And segments.
We are seeing shifts in segments where, for example, if I look at what are the 4 key major sectors that are causing what we're all seeing, it's your energy, which is about 25%. It's your transport, which is about 14%. It's your food, which is about, again, another 21%. And then it's your industry. These are the ones, industries, again, 21%. These 4 sectors are what's causing the climate change, right? We see that there's massive improvement in the first one, in how we are producing electricity. Things like, it's going to take up solar and wind will take up too much land space. That's been debunked, because if you look at the data, if you were to use solar energy, to give power to the entire world, you just need less than 5% of the land. If it's wind, it's less than 1%. If it's nuclear, it's less than 0.1%, right? So, and then people talk about, oh, it may have an environmental impact, right? Because you're using not coal or that, but you're using other material. Just until by 2050, you will only need about 300 million of say cobalt and copper and all those elements to be able to produce energy. On the other hand, you use for fossil fuel, you use 50 billion annually. So there's no comparison, right? And then there's things like, and the cost effectiveness I already spoke to. So because of technology, we've moved the needle on improving this sector. Then, of course, now we're talking about the transport. If you look at the emissions that come from the transport, primarily 80% is from the cars that we drive. Shipping, aviation, all of those things, 10, 11, 12%. But it's really what the problem really is vehicles and we see what's happening right now, right? The 2018 is when your engine, the combustion engine, started coming down in terms of the sales, from say 80 million to about 60 million. And at the same time, when you look at the graph for EVs, they are increasing from say 0 to about 18 million annually. So you can see that some of the solutions that are coming through in some of the sectors, and the same for food, we're not really there yet. Agriculture in terms of better productivity, how to reduce your emissions to be able to reduce that. We're getting there. There are some solutions. Then, for example, in the industry, people are coming up with better carbon capture and storage from, say, the cement, how you're using cement in the industry. People are experimenting with moving from limestone to silicon and other calcium silicates, which will allow you to reduce your emissions while you're producing that. We're not there yet in those sectors, right? So it's really
Not
about
to mention better insulation,
better
so you need
installations,
lesser energy.
Absolutely. So what we are seeing, business as usual, it's a very easy transition. It's a household level transition. So you don't need millions of dollars for Pakistan to do that transition because it just makes better business sense,
Of course.
right?
And that business sense, I think, is the key element, right? I was having this conversation with our good friend, Mr. Amar Habib Khan, who's been working on the e-bikes policy in Pakistan for a while. And one of the key questions that I had for him was, you say that you can replace the oil tanker with an e-battery, but then these individuals that you are targeting belong to a certain social strata, a certain rung of the socioeconomic ladder. They can't afford that battery. So how do you overcome that economic issue? And he had a very good response to it. I encouraged listeners to go and read the policy and what he's come up with. But the general idea was, if you make it easy for them and basically cost effective for them to be able to just get this battery, within 12 months, not only will that battery pay for itself, but then continues to work for the next 5, 6, whatever the life cycle of the battery is. And all things considered, reduces their expenditures on fuel used in commutes by somewhere between 78 and 80%, which is a massive number.
Absolutely.
To think about. And if you then you take that small microcosmic example of maybe we started the pilot in Islamabad and then expand it nationwide, the kind of impact that would have, not just in terms of earning potential, because people would have more money to be able to spend, I don't know, on children's education, on healthcare, on things that they actually need, versus, and the time, versus this whole survivor mentality that beyond a certain socioeconomic threshold, people are now very, very used to.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how you lay it out like that, because then it really takes me back to looking at some of the other developments that are happening right now. So you said, where's the money, right, to do these things? Let's look at the IMF example, where we've reached some level of agreements about the resilience fund. Which is to the tune of, say, 1.3 trillion. But what they're also asking you to do with that is to look at a carbon levy, right? What does that mean? That means you're just going to start using some formula through which you're going to tax your own people, with which you're going to raise funds, which will technically go into, or theoretically, sorry, not technically, into adaptation and other needs, right? So that's the sort of theoretical circle that generally these carbon levies are supposed to do. Yeah, sounds really good. But then let's go back to the original problem of climate change, right? Let's go back to the original problem of survival emissions versus lifestyle
Absolutely.
emissions. So there are the haves and have-nots in this country. There are people who, within Pakistan, the average that we spoke to is quite, the global average is pretty skewed in Pakistan as well. If you go for a flat
If you don't
levy,
mind me asking, what is the emission in Pakistan per person?
I think it's less than one ton.
Wow.
Yeah, close to that. So that's what you're dealing with, right, at this stage. Um, so so that's so the problem when you're trying to raise funds for a problem that obviously is not just of your own doing. What you're doing is that you are bringing the problem of what you're advocating against internationally, where you're saying this is a common but differentiated responsibility. We are responsible. We want to reduce the impacts of climate change, but those who caused it need to pay up. They need to do technology transfer, and we will do the adaptation on ground, right? So that's the sort of conversation you're doing internationally. But you're not applying the same common but differentiated responsibility lens to your own country, where obviously the my coping capacity to deal with a disaster or a flood in my village will obviously be very different than some other households that may or may not have a Kakakhel by the shore, right? So within that, look at the disparity. So when we come up with these policies to try and raise funds, we really have to look at the nuances. I know there are discussions about no, the levy should only be on the industry. Let's look at the ones where they are emitting, say, more than 35,000 tons per year, and they're coming up with. So these are all closed door conversations, and it's difficult to understand where it will settle ultimately. Yeah.
So you spoke about the carbon levies. I find that to be a fascinating conversation, especially because, to my knowledge, any kind of extensive carbon accounting has not really occurred for pretty much any industry in Pakistan. And one of the first steps that we have to take is to actually figure out which industry is emitting how much, what kind of carbon offset it needs. If we were to introduce some kind of a carbon market or carbon credits or whatever else there may be. What can you say about the progress made or that needs to be made as far as carbon accounting practices inside Pakistan are concerned? And what is keeping us from doing that? It seems to me that at least measuring what various industries are doing is a relatively simpler task, which will take, technical expertise, but perhaps not as much upfront capital. What is stopping us from doing it? Is it political will? Is it inconsistency of policy? Is it because strategically we've not thought it through?
No matter what you do at the end of the day, you have to know where you're starting off from. Whether it's developing a climate rationale for a climate fund program that you're developing, whether it's saying this is where we are and this is where we'll get with the money, whether it's saying, look, you're looking at your entire supply chain when you're doing imports from Pakistan. That's the whole the European Green Deal that we're all speaking to, the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is really about going back to the supply chain. And that's really saying, look, Pakistan, you're emitting more than you should be with producing, say, one towel as opposed to another developing country, and that's where we're going to start moving all our orders to. When you speak to some of these, so it's interesting. When you speak to some of these industries, Pakistan stopped 4 exporting industries. So this is textile, leather, surgical, and rice, which is your the 4 top exporters. What you will see in the conversation is that some of them are very advanced. Carbon accounting ke le, or carbon reduction ke le, whatever. Accounting is obviously different methodologies, different ways. Everybody is doing their own little part because of a certain brand that they are exporting to or producing for. So those are their contractual requirements with these brands, right? Once it starts becoming a government-to-government requirement, then obviously you need to get into details of creating, then you'll bend over backwards and you'll do all the baselines and you'll do all the accounting and whatever else that it requires ultimately. But what I want to refer to over here is that yes, currently at the moment, because of the requirements of some of these brands, and I'm talking big international brands, and we have companies actually responding to their needs. And an interesting anecdote over here, which I find, which I end up sharing everywhere. So we're trying to develop some funding mechanism for the export industry to bring in concessional financing to move and become energy efficient, so that we don't get the CBAM cuts and we don't have to do carbon levies. I mean, in a perfect world.
How do you reconcile the two? Where do you find, because you've been part of a lot of these negotiations internationally, right? And it seems to me that a certain lens is applied to all countries because all countries are equal, but all countries are not equal. Not in terms of resources, not in terms of capacity, not in terms of political will, not in terms of contextual reality on the ground. So when we are negotiating internationally, how do we build enough political capacity within our systems to try and ensure that these nuances are flagged in a manner that does not require, years of South Asian studies at Columbia University before arriving at the conclusion that, oh, maybe this does not apply to Pakistan?
Yeah. So when we talk about trying to do something about reducing the emissions, forget about Pakistan having to do what it needs to do. When you look at the details from, say, let's keep US to a side for now. You look at Europe, you look at UK, you look at all these people, what you realize is what is everybody committing to? It's not like we have to pollute a little bit. But I'm just going back to what you said. We have to pollute a little bit till we become green. What countries are saying, we will continue. They're saying we'll go net zero by 2050. What does net zero mean? That means I'm going to emit, but I'm also going to I'm going to offset, right? So nobody's going to go clean 100%, maybe some Scandinavian countries here or there. But other than that, it's all about how you're going to create a balance, right? So to think that there will be this perfect world where there will be a green transition for everybody, Pakistan pe baad mein aate hain. That's not happening, right? So let's just be realistic about the problem at hand.
Absolutely. That's a great rationalization.
फिर पाकिस्तान की बारी आती है. 100% we have mouths to feed, we have the 5th largest population to deal with, we have a bulging youth, we have energy needs. We have to balance it with the reality. Yes, we spoke about business case, and yes, we spoke about all of that, but it needs to be balanced with what you can and cannot do. Your commitment internationally to reduce climate is nationally determined, which means you decide. Nobody has forced, nobody has put a gun to your head where you've gone out and you've said that we'll reduce it by 50% by 2030. Yes, you have said it's conditional, 35% is conditional, etc. You have to look at your economic trajectory, you have to look at your economic needs, you have to look at industrialization, all those elements, and then you have to match. So yes, it's very important to have the capacity, capability to understand the nuances within the government, within some of these think tanks that actually should be doing some of these number crunching. And this is not rocket science. This doesn't require decades of study or anything. It's just practical, simple information at hand where you understand how much you've contributed to the problem. Let's not just talk about who's contributing right now. Let's look at it historically, and suddenly the data changes from China as the culprit to emitting 25% right now to actually US being the culprit if you really look at a different time horizon, right? So you're changing the conversation the moment you look at how you're looking at the problem. So Pakistan really needs to understand that it needs to balance it being a global good boy and saying, I will do everything and I will, whether you give me the money or not, to actually taking care
of its own people. What does the government need to do, or what does institutions like yours need to do in order to build more of this technical capacity, so we have individuals that don't just speak in tweet-sized, bite-sized, easily consumable content sound bites? 50% emissions, 200 million needed by XYZ, Pakistan is one of the 7th most, whatever. And actually talk about that and actually get into the nitty-gritty of the technical language that is needed to get Pakistan what it needs to get.
I like how we started off with the ability to negotiate to what it takes to negotiate, right? So this is one of the issues closest to my heart ever since I've been working in this field. So let's address some of the problems first in terms of why is it 5 or 6 people that know how to negotiate. When it comes to climate change, it's everybody wants a pie of it in climate action, but nobody wants to take responsibility for it in terms of how it's going to happen. Because if it's health or education or if it's whatever, there's a ministry for it, there's a department for it, and they're responsible. When you say climate change, is it the planning? Is it the Ministry of Climate Change? Because the ministry says, hey, I'm just in Islamabad. It's the provinces that are actually responsible for doing action on ground. Which is fine. It's fair. It's a fair way of looking at the problem. And then you have the finance ministry where they're saying, no, I don't have money for these climate bells and whistles on your projects. Really focus on what we really need to focus on. So that's really the problem in a nutshell. What does that translate into? That translates into a situation where everybody wants to do everything when it comes to climate. Negotiation requires a very different skill set. Negotiators are nothing without technical backstopping. Technical people are nothing without understanding what's happening on ground. So there's a proper supply chain that you need in order to reach those rooms to be able to negotiate. So let's not say one person, one expert, one department, one ministry will be able to pull this up. And that's where we fail each time, because we think that the technical person should be suave enough and have the diplomatic nuances to be able to negotiate in that room, and he doesn't. The negotiator cannot negotiate if he doesn't have actual data, the nuanced detailing, the legalities, the actual nitty-gritty of what that person is negotiating. Once they have that, then of course so we need to get out of this mindset where we think that it's everybody's business, but then nobody wants to raise their hand when things go south because they say, "Wo to uska kaam tha, wo to uska kaam tha," So we all end up doing that.
Yeah.
So that's very important, and we all need to realize that nobody is stepping on anybody's toes. Everybody has a very defined role to play in the entire supply chain, as I just mentioned earlier. So that realization is very important, and this is something that I keep talking about wherever I go, where I say, look, we are all complementary. Let's stop getting into rules of business. Let's stop getting into kiski kya responsibility hai, because wo sab defined hai. Bas uske upar aap use climate as a lens where every expertise needs to come out, right? And really, that's what it takes. You need the advocates. You need the people on ground. You need them to put pressure on the government to take certain decisions. जो कि हम अपने मुल्क की बात करें, negotiation separately. So it's really about understanding that we all have a role to play within our own expertise and in our own capacity, so that we put our strongest foot forward when we get into these negotiation rooms.
Yeah, the jack of all trades, master of none. What's the term in Urdu for it? Harfan Maula.
Harfan Maula.
वो यहाँ पे नहीं हो सकता.
Yes.
That's a great note. One last final question, if you'll allow me. We've spoken quite a bit about, the various geopolitical as well as climate challenges that Pakistan faces. But at one point, a term was used, and that term was silver lining. And because I'd like to end this on a bit of a more hopeful note, do you see any good things that are happening within the climate space inside of Pakistan? Be they our increased capacity to attract more financial capital, the creation of departments at the provincial level that are now apparently being strengthened, a bit of a shake-up at the climate ministry, the creation of the climate authority. Any of those positive signs, do you see any good coming out of this? Do we have anything to look forward to?
If we look at the problem globally, we realize that we're at that time in human history where industrial development is not in conflict with environmental impact. And the reason for that is, I would say maybe 3 things. the technologies that we've worked on, the institutions that are more nuanced, more sophisticated to develop and perhaps be able to implement some of these policies, barring the last couple of months, given whatever is happening. And lastly, we have smart people who don't think climate change is a hoax anymore.
I think a really interesting way that the same friend that I was having this conversation with put it recently. You know this friend. I'm not going to mention him. They said that the problem right now is that we are in this boat that has a hole in its base, and the hole needs to be fixed. And the people in charge are very busy putting on very expensive paint on the boat. And that, I don't need to say more for you to understand what that person meant, but I think that's a very useful encapsulation of identify your priorities. You can't just have a strategic vision without knowing which holes you need to plug. And I think that once it's aligned with national level priorities and what we need to do as a nation and as a country, and as a responsible member of the international community, of course, I'm not saying those two things are, at odds, then I think we have a better chance of being able to do well on the world stage. Kashmala, thank you so much for sparing your time. Every time I sit with you, there's 15 new things that I learn and about 16 new things that I need to go and Google and research and, learn more about and find out. I'm very grateful to you for you and for your brilliant mind and for your ability to encapsulate such complex information in such a nuanced and such an easy to understand way for a doofus like me. My sincerest thanks to you. Once again, this was Conversations at the Foothills. My name is Zeeshan Salahuddin. Thank you very much for joining us. Take care and join us for the next one.